We hope you're enjoying the Product-Led Festival so far. We've yet another exciting session coming your way, but before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to thank every one of our sponsors, speakers, and partners. Without them, we wouldn't be able to bring this incredible event to life. Don't forget, speakers are going to be answering your questions, so stick around and ask your questions to get the advice from a true expert in the field tailored to you. It's that simple. Now, enjoy the next session.
So, you want to change the world. Build something that makes people go, problem is, you'll be flying blind. You build product on one end, results come out the other, but in between is a massive black hole. And that's why we built Amplitude. It gives you a whole new understanding of customer behavior, predicts outcomes, and adapts experiences to drive world-changing results. You want to change the world? Now you can.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We are delighted to have you with us once again. We're going to go straight into the next session. I'm very excited about this one. We have got some great speakers, a great moderator, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So, what should you expect? Well, the topic under discussion is In God We Trust, All of Us Bring Data. So I will invite the panelists and the moderator to join me on camera. And while they do so, I will let you know that you can find lots more great content at productledalliance.com. Be sure to check that out. But I don't want to get in the way. So I'm going to hand straight over to Abby Kosman, who is from Amplitude, who's going to be moderating the session today. Over to you, Abby.
Awesome. Great to be here. Thanks so much, James. So really excited to moderate today's panel. I'm Abby. I'm a group product manager at Amplitude. Before that, I was in growth product at Dropbox, and really excited to be here on this panel because, not only do I work on building kind of the core of our self-service product analytics product, but also when I was in growth product at Dropbox, obviously data was essential to making all of our decisions. So really excited to be here to chat about this topic. With that, I'd love to also just give a chance to meet kind of the rest of the panelists here. So Chase, do you want to kick us off with an introduction?
Sure, thanks, Abby. Hi, everybody. I'm Chase Richards. I'm product analytics team lead at Zalando Payments in lovely Berlin. If you're in Europe and you've ever shopped on the Zalando platform and paid for something, which hopefully you have, that's us. I've been in analytics now for going on 8 years. In a previous life, I was a historian. So if you come from a non-trad background and are thinking about product or data, I'd be happy to talk with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that intro. Angel, we'd like to go next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Angel. I'm a product manager at shares.io, which is a social investing platform. And previously I was working at Wise. I am now in London, but originally from France, as you might have guessed.
Great, awesome. And then finally, last but not least, Mohit, will you please introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Mohit. I am a product manager at Bumble, a dating app which says make the first move. So I recently started here, learning quite a few things about dating space. Before this, I've worked across marketplaces and companies like Depop, Amazon, and a travel marketplace called Make My Trip. Originally from India, but moved to London around 2 years back. Just before, all of our lives came to a standstill because of COVID. So,
great. Well, really excited to chat with all of you about this topic today. Just one quick reminder is that please drop your questions into the chat throughout the session. We're going to be getting them answered in kind of the last part of the session today, but drop them in as we go along so you don't forget, and then we'll definitely get to those after the discussion. Great. So I'd love to kick it off maybe, Angel, with you and to learn a little bit more maybe about what the biggest win that you've had that's come from your usage of data. What impact did that have, either on your product, your users, your business, or your team? I would love to learn about that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe starting with from a product perspective, I think very simply it's 1,000 times easier to make the right decision when you use data. there are a few things. First, it like enables you to move from something that might be like a gut feeling, an intuition, all the way down to a decision, and in an objective way. I probably estimate that the likelihood of being right is around 10 times higher when you use data. A second thing is definitely like around prioritization, which is a huge part of like product work. It's really helpful to make those sort of decisions. And finally, and maybe that's something that people don't talk about as much, it's around deciding when to sunset an initiative and explore new opportunities. And I think it's really, really helpful in those cases. And maybe on a more personal level, I know that one of the biggest wins for me was that it really boosted my confidence level, where it helped me gain credibility. And what I found is that it's 1,000 times easier to convince a large crowd that you're doing the right thing when you can back it up with data compared to when you don't. And a good example is that I believe that without data as a product, you're pretty defenseless when the head of product comes to you asking you questions on the impact of what you prioritized, or like to justify your claims. And if you can't answer it and back it up, you really have a high chance of losing trust and then hurting your reputation to some extent.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think oftentimes if you're not working with data, then it's just someone's intuition over another person's intuition. And of course, data can also be qualitative as well, but definitely agree with that, especially when working with executive teams. Data definitely helps you be less defenseless for sure. Yeah, I'm curious, Chase or Moed, have either of you experienced something similar? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would just add that I think, especially given how it seems like discussions outside of work nowadays can be very fact-free, it's refreshing to speak on the basis of evidence, because that's what data really are giving us in the end. I think I found quite recently, we've had a big win when it comes, especially to how we work with data together. I found that, and it's easy for me to get on my soapbox as a product analyst, but I find that especially from an analyst perspective, especially if you're a product analyst, there's an expectation that you will be very proactive, that you will be very strategy driven, and that you are wearing kind of the product manager's hat at the same time that you're wearing the data practitioner's hat, and really being deeply immersed in the data. But I found that too often our team structures and our rituals and our processes don't actually allow us to come together and work as effectively with the data as we might. So that often we're very good at professing this commitment to being data driven or data informed or whatever you want to call it, professing it and speaking highly of the importance of data. But in our day-to-day business, maybe we're not actually coming together in a regular cadence meeting, for example, as product managers and product analysts together, reviewing movements and metrics, discussing things actually on the spot, so that analysts especially, and I'm thinking from that perspective first, can be immersed in the strategy and get to know, especially if they're more junior, what is the so what of the data? Why do we care? Sure, these techniques are cool, data are awesome, but what's the point at the end of the day? What is this for the business? So we've implemented in the past year and a half, really product development teams that bring together a weekly meeting, bare minimum, product managers, engineering managers, and product analysts together, so that we're actually making data part of our everyday and not just something that analysts are off in their tower working with and like dropping down a bucket with their findings whenever they've got something interesting.
Yeah, we've actually experienced something a little bit similar. Something that we've done at Amplitude is, we believe in kind of having the product North Star, right? That kind of guides the business. But then the way we structure our teams to, I think, kind of help, drive some of that data-driven thinking is then each of kind of our product pillars has their own North Star that ladders to that overall PD North Star or product development team North Star. And then even our actual teams or pods that work on more specific areas of the product have their metrics that actually then ladder to their pillars kind of North Star. And I think that also what that I've seen that enabler kind of a win for the team has been that, even the engineers and the designers on the team are also understanding actually how their work ladders up to that overall North Star. And I think, then that process that you're mentioning of regularly reviewing the metrics, like that makes more sense. They understand, they're really invested in the metrics and actually what their team is doing because they understand how it all ladders up. And then we also have more people thinking about when changes happen in the metrics, what's going on. So you're kind of, breeding more analysts throughout the organization, which has been a great win for us as we've continued to operationalize that. Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing those wins. I'd love to kind of shift gears and understand, a lot of teams are collecting now a lot of data, and, it's possible to collect and analyze almost anything. So I'm curious, when there is that ability to collect such a large amount of data, like how do you actually determine and prioritize what to collect? And maybe Mohit, you could start us off on this one.
Sure. I think first of all, like it's a great question, and it's a really broad question at the same time. What do we prioritize? And if I put, let's say, my product management hat on, it goes the same way. How do I prioritize tasks, right? So you can start from what your goal is. If it's a kind of exploratory research you're doing and you want to find some answers, do you need data to make any kind of decision? Let's say you ran an experiment and you're trying to make sense of what the results are, or if it's let's say you need to define certain success metrics for a product, what makes sense, or what doesn't, and what kind of correlation they have to whatever North Star you have chosen. It becomes very contextual in that sense, but you need to have these outcomes in mind, and then you work backwards from there, asking yourself those kind of questions that, I want to go in a certain direction, but there is a knowledge gap, and I want to fill that knowledge gap from, whatever data I have. And then, you find out, there are certain things which you can fill with that data, but still there are certain unknowns, and maybe then you think about going a level deeper, or you say, this is what helps me take a step forward, and I'll leave it to this. So I think the point I'm trying to make is it's very contextual, and you should have the same framework in mind while prioritizing the data which you use for prioritizing your product decisions. So what kind of impact it can bring, what kind of effort I need to employ to get this data out. A lot of times what happens is that the data is actually very complex piece, or the answer you're trying to find is very complex, and your analyst does not have that kind of bandwidth, or you yourself don't know how to find that answer, find that data. So you need to put all that in perspective and then prioritize what output you want, or what outcome you want from this exercise.
And maybe I completely agree. And also one way that I see it sometimes is sort of like, who are the users, or with whoever, my stakeholders, who are they? What are the characteristics that I would want to measure in order to inform my decision? And then there is that layer of what do they do, and what are the actions that they do, which are very relevant to the product that I'm building and the decisions that I need to make. And I think that my metrics basically is kind of, at least that's my mental model around what data am I tracking usually.
I think something we found helpful is really when we're thinking of what to track and what we still need to track is really thinking from the customer perspective. And what if I'm a customer, what steps in my journey are actually not visible to us then right now. I think the sort of evolution of tracking in the industry as sort of something when logging suddenly became useful to think about user or customer problems. Often when engineers, and I love engineers, but when engineers are leading the discussion, it's very much sort of, well, we don't track that, or who cares about the front end? If it's back end is what matters. But when we're really thinking about the customer experience, something like clicking a box really does matter. So we try to really bring that approach to decide how we track and not just sort of get locked in these old hierarchies of logging or back end trumps all or whatever.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We experience a lot of this working with customers at Amplitude too. I think we are constantly being asked, and part of what we do is also help customers figure out what to track. And one of the things we tend to do, very similar to what you were saying, Mohit, is really ask what are actually the business or product questions that you're trying to answer. I think a lot of people want to jump in straight to what's the surface area that I have and how do I log kind of every single event on that surface. But if you start more from a question perspective, then it starts to help you uncover, what really is essential. Because if you track too much noise, then it's also really hard to pull signal from that data as well. When you look at a 30-step funnel going, that's not every drop-off point of like hovering the link is maybe not critical in that flow. So definitely something that we consider, and also less work for engineering too, right? I think one of the things I've encountered with customers in the past too, or working in past roles, is getting engineering buy-in to actually log those events. And I think, Chase, you were kind of referring to some of this, but I think too, if you focus it on those questions and then also make an effort once that data is tracked to actually have engineering look at the results and see the impact and what we're learning, I think can help drive that motivation. Because honestly, logging is not the most fun thing to do in the world. So I do think part of it is also getting engineering buy-in and kind of getting the team motivated to understand why this is important. Great. Well, I kind of want to shift gears again. I know a lot of topics around kind of self-service versus what shouldn't be self-service go on. And I'd love to maybe understand, many product questions, I think a lot of people agree, shouldn't necessarily require a data scientist or an analyst to analyze them or answer them. And so I'd love to understand what you all think the role that self-service analytics plays within your organization and how it can be most valuable. And maybe we can start with you, Chase, on this one.
Sure. So we've been in the process of really implementing comprehensive self-service. This has been an ongoing project this year. Previously, we had, this BI tool or this BI tool, and there are some dashboards here and some dashboards there, but we were really lacking a kind of comprehensive landscape to understand the business without having the need of an analyst. And I think one thing for me, really working with the analysts as we implement this together, first of all, it's been a big win already. Like I've noticed how an engineering manager in his personal folder will have all of these dashboards built, and he's just looking at these on his own, and he's done this on his own. Or a product manager will show me the results of a deep dive he's conducted, just finding out things that have gone, some issues with a current release, and he's done this on his own. And it's so magical to see this discovery happening and this gleaning of insights without the need of an analyst. That being said, the self-service requires an analyst to build in the first place. And working with our analysts, it's been really instructive to me to think about how we as analysts, when we're building self-service for something that is scalable and sustainable, we're not just in it for the user experience or the customer experience of the people who use our product. It's also internal. We also need to think about our internal stakeholders, how they use dashboards, how they explore with data sources. And if we are sort of thinking in the old way and saying, well, in this tool, we could have one table for every metric. If you then go into your self-service solution as a stakeholder and you have to go to 40 different data sources for 40 different metrics, that's not a very good experience. So I think we're learning that when it comes to self-service, it's not just yes or no, do you have it? I think we can all agree that the benefits are really legion. It's also, is that self-service a good user experience for your internal customers, and really building things from that perspective rather than what's just
so you want to change
right now.
It seems like we had a video pop up there. But yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think I totally agree with you around kind of, it's not just do you have self-service, it's then I think a big part of what I've seen the product analyst job becomes is also just being a coach and someone who can actually really share their expertise in advising teams on actually how to use data, because it's also not just can you create the query or can't you, it's also can you actually correctly interpret the information that you're seeing. And I think that's something that, even if someone else is answering their questions, there's also an enablement piece around, how do you actually use data successfully to make decisions? And I think that's a really valuable part of the product analytics job as well. Yeah, I'd love maybe, Mohit, do you have thoughts on this topic as well?
For sure. I think, I totally agree with Jay said. I think as a product manager, if I have self-serve tools which can bubble up those data points and analysis, it brings me closer to data, and it helps me diagnose a lot of stuff at my end, reducing that dependency of going to analytics team and asking them if they can allocate some bandwidth and get answers to my own questions. Our day-to-day operations include a lot of such questions, which we need answer to maybe faster than other exploratory things. So I think that helps a lot. And couple of not trivial, but couple of things which we should, which every organization should be hands-on with, like to know who are our users, where are we getting most traffic from, which traffic converts better than others. This is something which I think almost everyone in the organization should know, and then the outcomes which we are driving, as a strategy. So what is our North Star, how whatever product or feature we build, how it impacts our North Star. So I think all these points at least should be covered under self-serve umbrella. There will be a lot more complexities involved, nitty-gritties involved, which may come later on, and where you need let's say more complex queries to be performed. But I think at least the surface level and the high level data should be self-serve and should be visible to everyone.
Yeah, maybe like one last thing as well is like quite often I think about it as where do I want to spend my time as a product manager, and where do I want to spend my analyst or the scientist to spend their time within their role. And what I see is that in companies that aren't using like self-serve analytical tools, PM then have to be very proficient with data, and they will end up spending a lot of time doing it. And for the PMs who are not proficient, they will then need to raise it to data analyst, creating a backlog, meaning they don't get access to this data immediately, which will slow down. And on the other side, data analysts, instead of doing meaningful, in-depth analysis, will end up doing trivial queries day to day, which at the end of the day isn't very valuable, like where product isn't having as much impact as they could, because either they're spending time doing things that analysts could do, or they're slowed down by the fact that analysts are like have that backlog, and analysts also don't have as much impact as they could because they're just doing trivial things that really don't bring that much value compared to like their skills. So for me, it's sort of like, it's more of like, how do you maximize your impact? And there's definitely that like first investment that you talked about, Chase, in terms of like, okay, it takes time to set it up. It takes a lot of effort, and it's just not simple. But once it's done, like the speed and velocity that everyone can get out of it is pretty significant. And it also like avoids that gap that I've had and I've noticed in like other companies, where if you don't have these self-serve tools, like data proficient PMs will have a huge advantage compared to like non-data proficient. And that doesn't mean that they are like way better PMs or anything. It's just that they have access to quick insights, which the other PMs don't have access to.
Yeah, just to add a funny side to it, optically they may seem like they're much more efficient PMs, but there's a flip side to this as well. So if you want everyone to be data driven or at least data informed, sometimes PM becomes a bottleneck as well in that scenario if you don't have self-serve analytics in-house, because stakeholders will start coming to you and ask for, oh, can you give me this data? Can you give me that data? And then, your entire bandwidth has gone into getting those data points for them, or, you redirect them to analysts. But in most of the companies, how this works is like PM is kind of a POC for all those communication. So, PM becomes bottleneck and PM's life becomes a little more difficult as well. So.
Yeah, I really like this interplay in the discussion we have between, there's efficiency on the one hand, and I think for anybody in an organization where there's skepticism about the value of self-service, just make that argument in terms of the analyst capacity that you free up, or having PMs who can work that much more efficiently through this, through having more time and capacity for analysts to work on the deep dive tasks that really require that level of expertise in the end. But I think also what we're hearing is that at the end of the day, it's also really about the culture, and practices inform culture and shape culture and create a framework for culture. And when you build self-service, you're building a really powerful set of not just tools, but practices that inform rituals and how people use data and talk about it. And you really level up the whole organization that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great, because I think we often hear like, how do you help convince an organization, or sometimes analytics orgs really want to hold on to all of the questions at times. But yeah, definitely can free people up. Angela used the word backlog, and it gave me flashbacks to making tons of requests of the product analytics partner that I had at Dropbox. I was in SQL pretty much all day, and Mohit, your comment about kind of, if you require that data-driven thinking, then it also can bog you down. It definitely, we were like that. We were very data-driven, but also writing SQL queries with internal tools all day at that time. And so definitely spent a lot of time doing that. And I remember there was one project we wanted to figure out, at the time I worked on free trial conversion, wanted to figure out what are the things that really drive that. Ended up being like a several months long project, because the product analyst was also dealing with all of the requests that we had at that time. And so every time a new thing got added to the backlog, that's where the flashbacks came from. It slowed down that more important project. But quite honestly, what would be maybe a simple question in maybe self-serve analytics, like writing a complex funnel is quite difficult in SQL. And so, your skills have to be quite good to do that in many cases. And so those questions were slowing down this project that ultimately probably would have informed the questions we were even asking. But it's this back and forth between those immediate priorities and this larger complex project that were kind of at odds. So definitely resonate with a lot of the things that people were sharing there.
I think just to add to what you said, Abby, and that's a very interesting take on this topic, and I'll pull in Chase into this debate as well at some point in time. To me, a lot of people say, or a lot of companies believe that, okay, analysts' job is to go and publish and pull off that data and publish that report. I think it doesn't end there. They are themselves like product owners or product managers of entire analytics function. That data becomes their own product, and they can actually start to evangelize all these practices, because yes, they'll be working on a lot more complex things, bringing out all those insights for everyone in the company to see and execute. But if they can actually make consumers of that data more independent, more autonomous, that will be like a big win for analytics as a function as well. So I think that perspective, I don't see like all companies having that kind of perspective, but I've seen in my experience, if companies do have that kind of perspective, they can move really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Chase, any thoughts on that, having being a part of the product analytics function?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's an opportunity here for really to impart to product analysts just the value and the dignity of really being curators and enablers and force multipliers here. I think there's what I would call a myth among product analysts that you really shouldn't be building dashboards, because all product analysts build dashboards, and that's part of the work. But I think doing this in a scalable way and making that initial investment and really thinking not just of the dashboards, but when it comes to self-service, the data sources themselves. And like I was saying earlier, building those data sources in a way that is really attentive to the needs of your customers, your colleagues. I think it really is a sort of curatorial role, and I geek out on that, but it's not something that every product analyst embraces readily. And I think if you're especially leading product analysts and trying to win them over to the worth of building self-service from that side, then thinking about it in those ways, and in the end, it's gonna free up your time. So if that's the only thing that it takes to convince the PA, by all means. But I think we really are enablers, force multipliers, curators of data here.
Yeah, I really like what you said, Mohit, on that point of like kind of thinking of yourself as a product owner, and like you're saying, this curator, this this person whose product really is like maybe data driven decision making, and how you accomplish that goal, and what are the different things that you do. And when we talk to product teams, some people have created like Slack channels where there's a clear process around asking questions of analysts when you get stuck, or there's really kind of impressive documentation or resources or internal trainings that are created, or meetings that are set up, just different ways people think about like their outcome and how they actually, what are the products really that they build to solve for those goals. So there's a lot of different ways that we've seen it happen, and I think someone mentioned culture too. I think how you enable it, it's honestly a fit to what's going to work for your culture. If you are a Slack culture, probably an ad hoc Slack channel where you can ask those questions when you get stuck and kind of crowdsource the community is going to work. And maybe if you're not really like that, then there's going to be a more, detailed process, office hours, that sort of thing, that might need to go on, and kind of fitting it to the needs of your customer, right? Who's the persona that you're solving for within your organization. I think one other thing that I've seen interesting here, and kind of depends on culture, and I'm curious what others have seen with your organizations with product analytics, is embedding the analyst on a specific team versus having a more centralized model. When I've seen embedded, what's great about it is actually almost back to that product owner part. You actually are, just as the designer is part of the like end designer PM trio, the analyst becomes that as well, and is also contributing to the product strategy and thinking about it in a different way. Obviously it can be resource intensive to go with a more embedded model, but I'm curious, what have people seen work there of like embedding product analysts on teams or data scientists versus having a more centralized model?
We're trying to get the best of both worlds, sort of. Maybe some would call this a matrix, like everybody means something different when they refer to a matrix org, so I'm not going to invoke that. But we, as a product analytics team, are embedded within a product organization. So I'm leading the product analyst, but we are reporting, rather I report to the director of product. And so we try to keep this knowledge sharing, the standards, the common tools, the common knowledge that kind of yield expertise together as product analysts. And yet we are directly embedded within product. We have these product development teams that map to our product lines that I mentioned earlier. And so we're really trying to have it both ways. And I would say that approach is working. It seems to be working fairly well. I've been in both kinds of setup, and I think the things you hear about, well, if you're in a central team, you tend to be more cut off. If you're embedded directly, and maybe if you're a PA, especially if you're a junior PA reporting directly to a product manager, maybe the learning opportunities aren't quite working out the way you would want. That can be a risk. I found that these things you hear, that they can be borne out in practice. But this sort of hybrid approach of having a clear product analytics team or pod within a broader product organization can be a way to really reap the benefits of both approaches.
Yeah, I've also seen this working really well, where I think it enables those teams to, on one side, be really close to the product teams and work very closely with them. But on the other hand, it also enables them to have like very in-depth, interesting and challenging projects, that things like in-depth segmentations and things like this, that as a product you wouldn't necessarily think of as like the highest priority, but is actually really helpful in driving like very key insights. And I could totally agree on this like idea of like having them kind of in the middle. as a team within the product org.
Great. Thanks so much for diving on that topic. Wanted to also, just before we move to the next question, remind everyone watching, please add your questions now. We're getting towards the Q&A portion of the session. So think of your questions now, drop them in the chat, and we will get to them in just a couple minutes here. So yeah, I'd love to kind of switch gears again and chat a little bit about something that I think comes up a lot. Definitely has come up for me in the past. And so I love this question, but what happens, when the data tells you something that actually goes against your gut or what you were expecting to find, or kind of your intuition was telling you? And, how can we get our teams to then trust the data and use that insight rather than dismiss it, or kind of just how you respond in those cases? And maybe Mohit, you could kick us off here. Uh-oh, he might be frozen. Well, as we wait to see if he comes back, maybe Anshel, any thoughts here on kind of this trusting, going against your gut when it comes to data?
Yeah, I think the first thing is like usually when something really doesn't make sense, it sort of tends to mean there is an issue with your data. And like the first thing I would assume is sort of like double check everything, because I know it's happened to me a million times that I panic and I'm like, oh my God, conversion dropped by 10 points. And as you look into it, it's just like actually event had an issue. And so it's definitely like, if you think it doesn't make sense, it probably doesn't. But then I guess that if you've double checked and really there is like, it's not a mistake, there is no error, it's actually like just the data is telling you something that goes against your expectation and your gut feeling, then I think in a way, like two things matter. And one is like your own ego, and it's sort of like accepting that, yeah, you might have been wrong, you might have made the wrong assumption, and your gut feeling wasn't right. And obviously it's always a bit annoying, and I wish I was always right, but I'm not. So like it's sort of like accepting what the data is saying. And what's also really important, like taking a step back, is like sort of company culture. And here it's like companies which really are able to innovate and truly use data in a meaningful way leave space for true experimentation, and therefore that means failure. And down the line, that means that teams are empowered to be wrong, they're empowered to fail in making efforts, and they know that there is a company culture that is comfortable with that idea. And I think that's when you can actually properly experiment and innovate, and that's probably the key requirement in order to let this happen.
Yeah, I love that, the kind of empowered to fail and kind of, accepting that as part of your culture. One thing we've tried to do is start up a process of at kind of our product development all hands, having teams share, results or retros of things that they worked on, regardless of whether it was a success. Sometimes I think we present on the things that were great successes. But I think when people openly share about what's failed and the data and information that led them to learn, that really can kind of unlock that culture and share with the team that, failure is okay. Yeah,
and I think it's like, it goes along with showing that you had to iterate. And it's important to remind like every team that usually most product, they didn't get it right the first time. And it's important to remind just to remember that like most great products take a few iterations, and they like down the line, most of these teams, even when they built, like they were the best product teams in the world, and they launched like really impressive products, they probably went through like a ton of like iterations. And yeah, I totally agree with sharing those like failure, and this idea of like it's wrong, but we're going to iterate is super important to ensure you have those like small experimentation and building loops and learn from them.
Yeah, one that makes a ton of sense. It reminds me of one of the projects that I worked on at Dropbox, was trying to switch our model from a credit card required free trial experience to no credit card required free trial experience. And I think we had a lot of intuition, not just intuition, but planning, thinking through why this would ultimately be more successful for the business in the long run. But then in launching the first experiment, it was a huge failure. But I think what was interesting there was we could have kind of packed it in at that point and moved on. But and you know, maybe you could argue we should have, but I think what we recognized over time and like looking back now is that of course it was going to fail. We had spent years optimizing the credit card required experience, right, with hundreds of experiments over time. And so the first time we launched a totally different model, like it was unreasonable to think it would be a win. And so then we spent, you know, time kind of iterating on that till it ultimately was successful. And I think proved out our initial hypothesis, but it was always interesting during that experience asking yourself, are you just trying to push forward on this kind of hypothesis you had about what would be better, or is it truly better, and kind of trying to work with data and think about that along the way. Yeah. I'm curious, Mohit, do you have thoughts on this kind of question of using your gut versus, you know, trusting the data in these cases?
Sorry, Abby, can you repeat the question for me? I dropped off for a couple of seconds.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of, you know, what do you do when the data tells you something that goes against your gut, and how do you help teams kind of actually trust that data or move forward with it rather than, you know, dismissing it because it doesn't match kind of what they were expecting?
Oh, that's a great question, and you know, one of the favorite ones for me when we are having this debate. So I think, first of all, data, I believe, can be looked upon from various lenses. So a lot of times we, or you know, any person who is actually relying on data, they create those kind of slices and dices which suits them, right? So you know, data can make or break things. So I think that's very important thing to know. So you have to look at data from you know, from a lens which removes all the biases in the system. That's the first point. And the second point is, you know, you can't rely totally on the data. So that's why I'm very skeptical of the term data driven. I prefer to use a term called data informed, right, or data inspired, because then you bring data is whatever, you know, you get, let's say, the points which you have captured, you know, the user journeys which you have captured, the experimental things which you have captured. It's actually kind of very reactive. You know, users have already performed that function, so it's very reactive. So you have to combine it with a lot of other macro factors, like what's happening in the market, what kind of trends are there, you know, what does your user research say, is all those points, and then you know, make a decision based on all that information. So I always you know, tell anyone who discusses this with me that you make data informed decisions rather than data driven decisions, because otherwise you are relying a lot on data and taking out human element from it, and that's really important. And the fact that, you know, it still hasn't been automated, you know, robots haven't taken over our roles, that is an evidence that we need you know, humans to make those decisions. Anyone who is telling otherwise, they don't want to take their decisions. It may be a strong statement, but it's true. So I think my answer to this question is that if you have removed all the self-selection bias, and if you are looking at data, you know, without that bias, then probably it will help you take the right decision. And if you combine this with all the other macro factors or all the other you know, information you have historically or through user research or anecdotally, you know, it will help you move in the right direction. And if you still don't have like enough evidence to move, then, you know, sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith.
I think picking up, Mohit, on something you mentioned a bit ago, just being skeptical of the data, because a healthy skepticism when you're looking at the data is really crucial, because so many things can go wrong. And sort of in this vein, I think some of the biggest challenges I can recall had to do not with stakeholders actually being skeptical of the data, but not being skeptical enough, and being credulous and maybe seeing what they wanted to see. And I think this is a particular risk when it comes to experimentation, and explaining just the fundamental, like the chaos of data and the randomness, especially early in an experiment, to stakeholders can be a minefield. And I think this is especially treacherous ground sometimes when it comes to like building trust in the data, not so much because people don't believe the data inherently, but because something went wrong with experimentation, you didn't explain randomness right, you didn't have enough transparency into how you were establishing statistical significance and so on and so forth. But I think just the risk of seeing what you want to see and being too trusting in the data for that reason especially, that can really pose a big challenge in my experience.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I feel like that is such a critical point, which is that it's not only that you can sometimes, ignore the data and then, kind of, make the wrong decision or go with what you want to hear, but also selectively using data to make your point is a huge issue, right? You can read, so, I mean, I've seen it before in experiment. Oh, we were only like 1% down. It's like, okay, it's great. But if you were 1% up, it's like, it was a win. And so that's just one example, but there's plenty of others just in terms of like interpreting trends or choosing one trend out of 10 to show a point when really it could just be that, there's two features and people use both equally, but you're just pointing to the one that you worked on. So I definitely think that's a critical point to consider.
Definitely. I just want to circle back on the example which you used earlier, Abby, around the credit card thing. So there are like if you run this kind of experiment, let's say in Southeast Asia, maybe you'll feel that people are resistant to putting credit cards, but an additional information around credit card penetration can help you drive that experiment a bit better. So because you don't have that much credit card penetration, and people may be comfortable using other means to pay rather than credit card. So I think those kind of data points help you in understanding the ecosystem much better and perform those experiments in a really scalable way.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think you mentioned kind of using market data, that type of market data to help make decisions. And I think something we didn't really chat about much, but I think goes with your point of data informed is also using qualitative data and pairing that when, the data doesn't tell maybe the full story and kind of, I know many product analytics functions work really closely with user research as well to kind of paint that full picture and explain when the data might be telling you something unexpected. So definitely something else to maybe consider. But I know we have only about 15 minutes left, so I'd love to move to audience Q&A. And I think, Moet, you have to drop at this point, right?
Yes. Sorry, I had a hard stop at 6:50, but thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. And if anyone from the audience have any questions which I can answer, you can reach me out on LinkedIn, or you can redirect your questions to James, and I can coordinate with James. But thanks everyone. It was amazing to be part of this panel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much, Mohit.
Thanks, Mohit.
Great. So let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A and definitely continue to add questions if you had them. The first one that we had came from Alexi, and they ask, how do you think we should think about prioritizing tasks for embedded product analysts in the product team? Should it be the team lead or the product manager? Maybe Chase, do you have thoughts on this, given you were kind of talking about that model?
Yeah, I think it depends here on whether we're referring to, sort of internal housekeeping tasks, internal organizational tasks, building self-service, which I think we should not expect stakeholders to have insight into how complex that is. But of course, we need to make the capacity constraints visible there. I think to me, that's a more straightforward question. If we're talking about the internal tasks, I think that prioritization should be set internally within the product analytics team, but then making the capacity requirements clear to the rest of the product team and how that then may impinge on prioritization of other product development related work is super important. I think when it comes to actually prioritizing the more straightforwardly product development work, so not talking about internal PA team tasks, I think that really has to be something collaborative. One thing we have now, just as the team setup for us is sort of hybrid, is that this prioritization is kind of a hybrid enterprise. There's a review of Jira tickets that happens within the context of the product development team, but also there's double checking that goes on between me and my directs, separately between the analysts and the area lead, and so on and so forth. So I think it depends on exactly what kind of task we're talking, but if we're talking about the product development work, that really has to be collaborative enterprise.
Yeah, I can just add one thing, which is I think at the end of the day, I think that the product, if you're working in this embedded model, what I'd seen work is that the PM isn't necessarily, controlling the work, but because the analyst is embedded, they're thinking about what does the product team need to make decisions and is working directly with the PM on that. But they're their own role reporting maybe to an analytics lead who can help them think through, is what I've come up with the right prioritization? And then to your point, Jay, is there other internal product analyst team tasks that need to be brought into that mix? So I think when I've seen the analyst embedded, they're not necessarily reporting to the PM, but they're an equal partner the same way that, engineering might, have opinions on what they should work on and design. And it's kind of a collaborative effort there. We have a similar question, which is how do you manage, from Shamir, how do you manage domain responsibility division in an embedded analyst PM structure? The analyst does the model development and presents to leadership, or does the PM take over the presentation in those cases?
Yeah, I would say that really depends on the analyst. I've worked with analysts who really enjoyed presenting and really felt empowered by it. And in those cases, I'm always like, if you've worked on something, I'd much rather like you present your own work. Like usually I believe that you're way better like advocate for something you've built yourself. And of course, always happy to jump in to help to facilitate. But for me, like the default should be the analyst present the work that they've done with support of like PM. And there are some exceptions where I've also worked with analysts who really, really dreaded any form of like public speaking. And well, in that case, fine. Like I think PM can take over. But for me, the default should be whoever did the work should present the work. You just are a better advocate.
Yeah, I think we need to put PAs on the spot. I mean, it can be a lot of pressure, and I know that the PAs will tend to be a little more introverted, PMs maybe a little more extroverted. Maybe these are cliches, but it's in my experience. But I think PAs really should be encouraged to develop these skills. The hybridity of the role really requires that you be able to speak to people and communicate things clearly, have the stakeholder management. And I think these skills that we build by encouraging PAs to do this, like the communication is so important. In the end, that's really what's going to make you shine once you've mastered the technical tools required of the role.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think definitely defaulting to whoever did the work present. And I also agree. I think trying to get people to present the work and kind of be asked to answer questions about it and kind of get into the discussion, I think can be helpful for sure. So we have another question from Kritika. Empirical versus anecdotal references. Is it underrated or overrated? Any thoughts here?
So with empirical, I assume we're referring to evidence and data.
I think so.
And anecdotal, we're more in the realm of gut feeling. This is my experience.
Yeah.
I think it sort of goes back to healthy skepticism, is that we really should value data and value data as hopefully objective evidence. And I say that as somebody, of course, who's working very directly with data. But I think the frame that we bring through our own experience, if this is a realm of anecdotes, I think this is getting really theoretical, but if this is a realm of anecdotes, I think experience can be a healthy check, and bringing experience to bear on data, not like this is my gut feeling, but I really want to approach this with like a reasoned skepticism. So I don't know that I want us to like throw around anecdotes in sort of this loose way, but certainly bringing experience to bear with a healthy skepticism, and also not really anecdotes, but bringing in qualitative data like we were talking about early as a frame, especially when the data just aren't telling you enough.
I think one thing as well where it might be like, sometimes I've seen it where data can almost like slow you down a little bit, where something is like obviously right. And we're like, how you're going to test it? And it's like, well, we're not going to test something which is like an obvious improvement in the experience and spend 3 weeks on things. So I would like, whenever you have a hypothesis and you need to verify it, I think like empirical is really important in this, because whenever it's not obvious, but if it's obviously the right thing to do, which happens many times, it's like, just do it. And I've seen very like data-driven company culture where it gets really hard to move fast because of data, because everything is like, but did you test it? It's like, why would I test this? Like, it's like we removed the bug.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I definitely think there is a balance to when is testing. I think it's a great point, especially because not every organization also had the volume and traffic and the luxury to test absolutely everything. And I that's something we didn't discuss, but I think sometimes in the absence of a ton of data, how do you use data to make decisions and or how do you make decisions without it? So I think that's something important to consider is when do you want to spend the time to run an experiment or, really go in depth on something, and when do you kind of just need to move quickly, roll something out. And then you were mentioning it earlier, Angel, iterate. Like, maybe the first thing is better, but there's probably more you can do. So I think that there's different tools in the toolkit to use to improve on things. Learn. One last question here we had was around that they love the story about how data democratization is already transforming, I think, your org, Chase, and how did you go about securing the buy-in and momentum to get the organization to invest in the year-long effort to go there? And as a follow-on, is your team a product of that investment, or were you already in place ahead of the self-service drive that you were talking about?
Good question. So I'll answer the latter first. We were already in place. But having experienced self-serve elsewhere, I really wanted that force multiplier to come in, and I wanted to free up capacity for us. Granted, that initial investment requires capacity, and that can be painful. I think getting the buy-in really was, when it comes to decision makers who are focused on the bottom line, I think you really do have to emphasize the efficiency aspect, the cost savings, even if that comes down to like speaking in terms of the compensation of a single analyst and what you think the gains could be if you, let's say, are able to detect an incident that would have cost much more than the compensation for a single analyst. It sounds crass, but I think putting your finance hat on and making the investment in these terms to certain stakeholders, that can really be helpful. But we did like a proof of concept. We did a study. We broke down the numbers in this way in terms of efficiency savings, but also appealing to like the cultural wins, making metrics part of our bread and butter. I think if you can propose things bearing in mind the positions of the different decision makers who will read your proposal, come together to decide, I think it's really about covering your bases. And when making this kind of proposal, it can be frustrating. You feel like you've written the greatest thing ever. Who could ever doubt the power of data? But somebody is always going to have a certain angle, and it's valid to address that. And so I think our success in getting the buy-in was really having this multifaceted POC, this proposal that covered the bases, and then securing that investment, because it's an investment, of course.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I think one thing that's interesting you mentioned was around sometimes one of the ways to talk about the value is through like the loss prevention as well. I think talking about a hypothetical win you could have with data sometimes feels less tangible than talking about, hey, if we'd noticed the drop off in this critical point, we would have saved this amount. So definitely an interesting thing to think about, like efficiency, obviously returns in the future, but also loss prevention in those cases as well. But yeah, I think we're coming up on time here. I know James wants to kind of send us off. So just wanted to thank you both and Mohit as well, but Chase and Angel, really interesting conversation. So happy to have this discussion today, and thanks everyone for attending this talk as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Had a great time.
think James is slowly video waking up here to come back.
So,
Need a drum roll. Hopefully this platform is getting the data back about not being able to return.